For 3 decades, one of wrestling's darkest rumors has refused to stay buried. Randy Savage leaves WWF. WWE seems to erase him for years, and fans keep coming back to the same uncomfortable question. Was it just business, or was it something far more personal? Then years later, Stephanie McMahon praises Macho Man on camera in a way that sent the internet into a spiral all over again. And that's when this old story came roaring back to life. Before we go any further, if you enjoy deep wrestling stories that go beyond the headlines, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because this one is messy, complicated, and still impossible to fully explain. Now, let's be clear right from the start. There is no confirmed proof of what people have whispered about for years. No public admission, no official record, no on-the-record statement from the two people at the center of it. What exists instead is a chain of backstage stories, repeated claims from people around the business, a timeline that made everyone uncomfortable, and a silence so complete that it only made the rumors stronger. And that silence is exactly why the story never died. The version most people know goes like this. Randy Savage left the WWF in late 1994. On paper, there were reasons that made sense. His role had changed. Vince McMahon wanted him on commentary more than in the ring. Savage still wanted to wrestle. His contract expired on October 31st, 1994, and instead of staying, he jumped to WCW. That alone was a huge move. Savage was one of the biggest stars in the industry, and when he left, he reportedly took the Slim Jim sponsorship with him, which made the split even more painful for WWF at a time when every dollar mattered. That should have been the whole story. A major star leaves. Bad blood follows. It happens all the time in wrestling. But with Randy Savage, people inside and outside the business never believed that was a full explanation, because the fallout felt too personal. For more than 20 years, Savage seemed to sit in a strange kind of exile from WWE history. Fans noticed it. People in wrestling noticed it. And one of the biggest reasons a rumor kept living was because the punishment never seemed to match a normal business disagreement. Contracts expire. Stars jump ship. Rivals come and go. But this felt different. This felt like something had happened that Vince McMahon took personally. And that is where the Stephanie rumor enters the story. In the early 2020s, Dutch Mantel was asked about the long-running claim that Randy Savage had some kind of inappropriate involvement with Stephanie McMahon around the time Savage left the company. Stephanie would have been around 17 or 18 years old in that period, depending on the exact date people were talking about, which is one reason the rumor has always been so explosive. What made Dutch's comment so striking was not that he said he had seen proof. He did not. It was that he described the story as something that, backstage, had been treated almost like accepted truth. He said he heard it in the company, not years later on the internet, not from fans, from people working there. That matters because Dutch was not speaking as some random outsider repeating message board gossip decades after fact. He entered the WWF in early 1995, only a short time after Savage's contract expired. According to Dutch, the rumor was already there when he arrived. It was part of the air in the building. And then he said something else that kept this story alive. According to Dutch, agents in the company had supposedly warned Savage to stay away from Stephanie. Think about that for a second. We're not talking about nameless chatter from the back of a locker room. We're talking about senior wrestling figures. People close to power, allegedly pulling aside one of the biggest stars in the business and telling him to keep his distance from the boss's daughter. That kind of warning is the detail people never forget, because whether the rumor was true, exaggerated, or completely misunderstood, the idea that those conversations may have happened made the whole thing feel more serious than ordinary gossip. Dutch did add an important qualifier. He admitted he could not personally prove it was true. He said he never directly confronted Savage about it. But even with that disclaimer, he kept returning to the same point. Backstage, people treated it as more than just a random rumor. And that is what made the story dangerous. Not proof, consensus. In wrestling, a rumor repeated often enough can harden into something people stop questioning. Once that happens, it stops behaving like gossip and starts behaving like memory. That's when it becomes almost impossible to kill. Dutch was not the only name attached to this story. Brian Knobbs was also asked about it in another interview. And the interesting part, there was not even Knobs' answer, because he mostly played it safe. The interesting part was that the interviewer casually mentioned Randy Savage had once told him something about the matter off the record. That one little detail added fuel to a fire that was already burning for years. The interviewer did not reveal exactly what Savage supposedly said. So again, we are not dealing with proof. But the fact that the subject kept popping up in interviews with people from the business told fans this was not some tiny rumor born online. This was a story that had traveled from locker rooms to podcasts to fan communities and never really disappeared. And then there's a timeline, which is one of the biggest reasons this whole thing became so controversial. Stephanie McMahon was born on September 24th, 1976. That means she turned 18 in September of 1994. Savage's WWF contract ended on October 31st, 1994. So if anything happened at all, the supposed window people point to is incredibly narrow. Depending on when you place it, the implications shift dramatically. Before September 24th, she would have been 17. After that, she would have been 18. That is why so many people who discuss this story get pulled into the exact dates. The timeline changes everything, and yet nobody has ever publicly nailed it down. No one at the center of the story ever came forward with a direct, detailed account. So all people were left with was a calendar, a rumor, and a lot of speculation. Then the story picked up an even more intense layer through another Stephanie entirely. Not Stephanie McMahon. Stephanie Bellers, better known to wrestling fans as Gorgeous George, Randy Savage's later partner in WCW. Bellers became one of the most discussed sources in this entire saga because she claimed Savage told her directly that something had happened. According to her, the conversation took place on a beach while both of them were under the influence of ecstasy. She said Savage described some kind of encounter involving Stephanie McMahon, adjoining hotel rooms, and a situation that he framed as mutual. This is a part of the story that spread like wildfire online. Why? Because it sounded closer to a first-hand confession than anything else people had. For years, whenever fans argued over this rumor, they eventually circled back to Bellers and what she claimed Savage told her. To a lot of people, that became the centerpiece. But it also comes with major problems. First, Bellers was recounting a private conversation from an altered state of mind. That matters. Memory is shaky enough under normal conditions. Add drugs, time, emotion, and years of distance, and certainty becomes almost impossible. Second, the claims surfaced publicly long after the relationship ended and long after Savage died, which many was never able to confirm, deny, clarify, or challenge what was being attributed to him. Third, Bellers and Savage did not part on good terms. Their breakup involved bitterness, legal threats, and lingering resentment. None of that automatically makes her dishonest, but absolutely means her account has to be treated carefully. So once again, we run into the same wall. The story feels significant, but the evidence is slippery. Still, the reason people kept taking it seriously is because Bellers' claims didn't exist in isolation. They seemed to line up with what others had hinted at for years. The backstage warnings, the strange long-term hostility, the feeling that Savage had crossed a line with Vince McMahon that went beyond contracts, sponsorships, or creative disagreements. Separate pieces, same direction. And to understand why so many people found the rumor believable in the first place, you have to understand Randy Savage himself. Because Savage was not simply intense on camera. By almost every account from people who knew him, that intensity was real. The jealousy, the possessiveness, the need to control his surroundings, the inability to separate the performer from the person, all of that followed him behind the curtain. The most famous example is Miss Elizabeth. Savage and Elizabeth's relationship has become one of wrestling's most iconic love stories on screen, but behind the scenes was far more complicated. Bret Hart spoke openly about how much people loved both of them, especially Elizabeth, who he described as classy, warm, and easy to admire. But Bret also said that Randy's jealous persona was not really a performance. It was him. The man fans watched acting paranoid on television was, in Bret's view, very close to the man backstage. That is an important detail because it colors how people interpret every other rumor about Savage. Bret said Savage would get upset over something as small as someone looking at Elizabeth, not flirting, not touching, not crossing a major line, just looking. That was enough to trigger suspicion. Hulk Hogan shared a story that paints a similar picture. During a match in Paris, there were no steps near the ring, so Hogan lifted Elizabeth into the ring because there was no other practical way to do it. According to Hogan, Savage exploded over in the middle of the match and grabbed her for real, not as part of performance. Hogan has described as a moment where the match itself started falling apart because Savage was genuinely furious. Bruce Pritchard told another story about Savage nearly losing it over a planned TV angle where Sensational Sherry was supposed to slap Elizabeth. As the story goes, Savage got worked up before the plan was even fully explained, and Vince McMahon himself had to calm him down. These stories matter because they help explain why people saw Savage as someone capable of blurring lines and turning emotion into obsession. Whether that makes the Stephanie rumor true is another question. It doesn't, but it helps explain why many in wrestling never dismissed it instantly. Savage had a reputation that made people think, maybe, and in stories like this, maybe is enough to keep a rumor alive for generations. Elizabeth and Savage divorced in 1992, and by several accounts, the split left both of them emotionally wrecked. Bret Hart once said that after they separated, neither of them seemed like the same person anymore. There was a sense that the road, the pressure, and the constant closeness had damaged them in ways that never really healed. That matters too, because by the time Savage entered the final WWF phase of his career, he was no longer the same man who had ruled the company in the late 1980s. He was older, frustrated, no longer positioned the same way, and still carrying the emotional weight of a broken marriage that had defined much of his adult life. Then comes the exit. By 1993 and 1994, Savage was moving away from being a central in-ring star and toward commentary. Vince wanted his voice. Savage still wanted the ring. That tension was real. The WCW jump was real. The financial sting involving Slim Jim was real. All of that already gave Vince reasons to be angry. But according to Dutch Mantel, Vince's issue with Savage was deeper than business. He believed the anger was personal. And if that's true, then the alleged Stephanie situation becomes, in people's minds, the missing puzzle piece that explains why Savage felt frozen out for so long. Randy Savage died on May 20th, 2011, after suffering a heart attack while driving in Florida. His wife, Lynn, was with him. The vehicle crossed traffic and crashed, but the medical findings later made clear the crash was a result of a heart attack, not the cause of death. He was 58 years old, with severe blockages, arteries, and an enlarged heart. It was a shocking end for one of wrestling's most unforgettable stars, and like so many deaths in wrestling, it instantly turned memory into mythology. Stories that were once whispered became louder because the man at the center of them was gone. No more clarifications. No more answers. No final interview to settle anything. For years later, WWE finally inducted Randy Savage into the Hall of Fame in 2015. For many fans, that was overdue. For others, it raised an old question. If the relationship between Savage and WWE had been so broken for so long, what changed? And that brings us to the moment that sent this entire story back into overdrive. The video. In 2015, Stephanie McMahon appeared in a WWE video, naming her top 5 WWE superstars of all time. She put Macho Man Randy Savage at number 1. Not just high on the list. Number 1. Above Hulk Hogan. Above Shawn Michaels. Above everyone else. Even without any rumor attached, that alone would have gotten attention. But then came the way she described him. She praised his intensity, his presence, the way he moved in the ring. Then she used language that, in the context of everything the internet had spent decades whispering about, hit like a thunderclap. She talked about how rough and big he was and how he made her feel a certain way. She said no other wrestler made her feel the way Macho Man did. She said she missed his sexy long hair and beautiful beard. She even said, in essence, that his spirit would always be inside her. Taken at the most innocent possible level, this was tribute language. Playful, exaggerated, maybe awkward, but meant as praise for a larger-than-life performer. That is the charitable reading. But the internet did not hear it that way, because context changes everything. If those lines had been said about almost anyone else, maybe people would have laughed and moved on. but said about Randy Savage, after years of one of wrestling's most infamous rumors, people immediately read the clip through that lens. Suddenly, the old story was back in every comment section, every forum, every reaction video. Not because Stephanie confirmed anything. She didn't. Not because anyone produced new evidence. They didn't. But because those remarks landed on top of 20-plus years of suspicion, gossip, and unresolved history. And that's really the core of this entire saga. There's no definitive proof. No police report. No public confession. No documented 1994 statement from either Randy Savage or Stephanie McMahon laying out exactly what happened, if anything happened at all. No airtight timeline. No clean ending. What exists is something much more frustrating. A collection of secondhand stories from people in wrestling. A rumor that people backstage allegedly treated seriously. An ex-partner's explosive claim about a private confession. A strange period of apparent hostility and distance between Savage and WWE. And years later, a tribute video that many fans felt sounded far too loaded given the history. It's not enough to prove the rumor, but it has been enough to keep the rumor alive. And maybe that's why this story still unsettles people so much. Not because the answer is obvious, but because it isn't. Wrestling fans are used to eventually finding the truth. Somebody writes a book. Somebody breaks in an interview. Somebody leaks the real story. But this one never resolved cleanly. The people who could settle it most directly never did. Savage took whatever he knew to the grave. Stephanie McMahon built an entire public life and never publicly addressed the rumor head-on. So all these years later, fans are still staring at the same fragments and trying to force them into a complete picture. And the truth is, that picture may never be complete. Maybe there was a misunderstanding that snowballed into industry folklore. Maybe there was something inappropriate that people around the company caught wind of. Maybe the entire thing was exaggerated from a few warnings, a few assumptions, and a few loose conversations until it became one of wrestling's permanent urban legends. We don't know. And as unsatisfying as that is the only honest answer. What we do know is that Randy Savage left a mark on wrestling that will never fade. He was one of the most intense, charismatic, and unforgettable performers the business has ever seen. Even the people telling these stories, even the ones wrapped up in the rumors, usually come back to the same conclusion about him inside the ring. He was a real deal. That part isn't speculation. That part is fact. And maybe that's why this entire story has endured the way it has. Because when a legend that big collides with a mystery that personal, people can't let it go. The names are too famous. The consequences feel too severe. The silence feels too loud. So the story keeps coming back, generation after generation, with one question that still has no clear answer. What really happened in 1994? If you followed this rumor for years, you already know how frustrating this is. If this is your first time hearing it, welcome to one of wrestling's oldest unanswered questions. Either way, after all the interviews, all the theories, all the clips, and all the decades of debate, we are still left in the exact same place. No proof, no closure, just a rumor that refused to die.